Tonight, I'd like to share with you a message titled Sacred Love is a Landmark. And when you think about the word landmark, I think that we recognize it's something that gives perspective, it gives boundaries, and in many ways, as we think about God's view of intimacy and the world's view of intimacy, there's really quite a divergence, and how we think on that question really helps us to mark boundaries and to have some perspective, and it really establishes a worldview. Well, Douglas O'Donnell, this is a man who wrote a book on Song of Solomon that I've been reading. He says, there is a world of difference between God is love and love is God. Some people will actually deify love and worship love as if that is the most important thing in life. So when people depend on the feeling of love and the act of love to be the answers to life's troubles and the sources of life's meaning, something good turns wicked. He quotes from C.S. Lewis, and he said it this way: love having become a god, small letter G, becomes a demon. Think about that. Something that kind of rules over you and oppresses you because you have exalted the wrong thing as your God. But rather, the Bible says to love the Lord your God, the true God, with all your heart, soul, and might. And nothing else should take his place as the ultimate object of our love. Christianity seeks to destroy the idol of sexual intimacy in our hearts and build in its place the understanding that intimacy is a blessing from and a bridge to God. So we're going to kind of unpack that tonight, develop that, understand that tonight. But to kind of summarize, this would be our main truth tonight: because intimacy is God's gift, it must be kept secret, safe, and sacred. And that's really kind of what our whole study has been about, recognizing that sacred love is something that not only encompasses the divine love, but also the human love that God intends for us to have. So I'll say it one more time: because intimacy is God's gift, it must be kept secret, safe, and sacred. We're going to see that tonight. But how does the shepherd, who we've been introduced to, we left off in chapter 3 by seeing the contrast between Solomon and the shepherd, and emphasizing that the shepherd and the shepherdess have already been united in matrimony. And now the shepherd, he is seeking to protect his intimacy with his spouse. How does he do that? Well, I would say in two ways. The shepherd protects their intimacy in two ways by first, number one, verses 1 through 7, praising her attractiveness. So number one is he praises her attractiveness. That's your blank for number one, attractiveness, verses 1 through 7. And then secondly, tonight we'll look at chapter 4, verse 8, down through chapter 5 and verse 1. Number two, he partakes of her appeal. He partakes of her appeal. I emphasize the word her because there is exclusiveness that God has designed for there to be in intimacy. Let's begin with prayer as we look at these two ways that the shepherd protects the intimacy that he shares with his spouse. Father, I pray tonight as we get into this passage, even though it may be unique, I pray that you'll help us to see the practicality and be able to see that you created intimacy for a husband and a wife. And Lord, it's meant to be expressed not only in a physical way, but also in a relational way, a spiritual way, Lord, a social way, so many other ways. I pray that you'll help us to see how all of this fits together and be able to then communicate to even our children, our grandchildren, friends, co-workers, what your word teaches about this very important level of human relationship. And Father, may we have a deeper knowledge and a deeper closeness with our spouse if we're married tonight. In Jesus Christ's name I pray. Amen. Well, this is one of those passages that typically is avoided by those who would study Scripture because it is very blunt. It's very clear that there is a warmth, a love, an intimacy that is shared between a husband and wife in this passage. But I think all of us are married tonight, and we've experienced that. So I think what we can see here is nothing shocking, nothing new, but it's kept in its proper context, which is the marriage relationship. And that's why I think it's helpful for us to see that this is a topic that we should be aware of, that we should talk about in the proper context, in the proper way, and to be able to help our young people not to just avoid the topic, not to just avoid thinking about it, but to think about it correctly, biblically. Otherwise, the world will get the first opportunity to speak to them and tell them many false things and develop many false expectations. So that's why I think this chapter is very important, and I'm glad we're able to study it tonight. So let's begin by looking at the first way that the shepherd protects the intimacy that he shares with his spouse. I call her the shepherdess, and that is he praises her attractiveness. So look with me at verses 1 and 2 here in chapter 4, and the first thing he praises about her is her face. So letter A is her face. And I think it's important for us to remind ourselves, yes, I think we as men are visually oriented, and yet we need to focus first on a person's face, specifically the eyes, because that is the window to the soul. And I think any woman would prefer that a man address her and speak to her in such a way that he's speaking to her soul, to her heart, rather than just focusing on the outward appearance. So look with me at verse number 1. We'll start there. He says, "Behold," or take notice. This is something he wants her to know that he truly believes, he truly feels. "Thou art fair." Fair meaning beautiful. And he says, "Thou art fair, my love." And so he refers to her as the one he loves, not just based upon her appearance, but based upon who she is on the inside. And so this is kind of a pet name. He doesn't use her actual name, but he calls her his love, which I think many times spouses do. And I think it's a beautiful thing for a spouse to have a pet name to express the love that he or she has for the spouse. And then he says it again, "Behold, thou art fair." That means he really means it. In fact, he's going to repeat it a couple more times down later in this context. And so that means he's not just saying it because he's expected to say it. He's saying it because he really believes it. He really means it, and he wants her to believe it. I think it's often the case that a lady doesn't feel as lovely or as beautiful as perhaps someone else observing her. And she may be insecure about that. So husbands, let me just remind you, it's important for you to repeatedly and to often remind your spouse that you appreciate her beauty. And let her know that you notice and that you think she is beautiful, that you still have an eye for her, that she still catches your eye. But then notice right away, he starts by describing her eyes. And I mentioned this already, that it's important to, again, speak and to identify and look somebody in the eye and to see that as the source of their beauty, which comes from their heart, from their soul. He says, "Thou hast dove's eyes within thy locks." And so he compares her eyes to dove's eyes, which are gentle, which are peaceful, which I think indicate that she is warm and welcoming to him, and she's not scowling at him. She's not got a hard look in her eye, but that there is warmth there. And also, it's as if she is peering through. The word locks here can either refer to something that's clasped, like maybe a veil over her face or her hair, or it could be referring perhaps to her hair, which is kind of serving the same function of kind of veiling her face. Maybe you've seen a woman kind of look through her hair. Maybe you only see one eye. The other eye is kind of covered with hair. And so it's kind of a shy expression, a shy way of appearing. And he notices that she may feel a little insecure, but rather perhaps we could say she's one who is modest, that she is not trying to flaunt herself, but that she is peering at him through the locks. Maybe it's the veil, maybe it's her hair. Either way, notice now he does talk about her hair. He says, "Thy hair is as a flock of goats." Now, I understand. In our culture, we probably wouldn't use that metaphor, We don't really spend time around goats or sheep. But imagine a shepherd and a shepherdess. They're very familiar with sheep and they appreciate sheep. And so, as I thought about that, maybe they're thinking of a distant hillside where a flock of goats, maybe they're dark in color, are just kind of running down a hill, running down a mountainside. And so it's kind of the idea of cascading, probably darker colored hair. She mentioned back in chapter 1 that she has a darker complexion from being in the sun. So likely, I think she probably had a darker hair color, but we don't know for sure. But he says that her hair is full, it's not thinning, it's rich, and also he says that it appears as if it would be this cascading herd coming down the hillside of Mount Gilead, a beautiful region known for its shepherds and for its sheep and for its goats. So again, we may not use that metaphor, but it's designed to suggest that she has very full and beautiful hair that's very long, maybe coming down across her shoulders, maybe down her back, and so that would be a great indication of her beauty. Now, verse 2 is kind of interesting, kind of amusing. It says, "Thy teeth are like a flock of sheep." So first, he mentions that her teeth are white. We would assume that the sheep are white, and that's a good thing to have white teeth. That means that they're clean. They're able to be, shining behind her lips. Then it also mentions here that they're even shorn, so that means that they're kind of straight, probably using the metaphor in that way. Her teeth aren't crooked and all going different directions. That's a good thing. By the way, they didn't have dentists and orthodontists back then, so this was perhaps somewhat rare to have straight teeth and beautiful teeth. He also says that they, as if they came up from the washing. And you never smile and somebody can notice you've got something stuck between your teeth. So these are clean teeth. They're clean teeth and they're attractive teeth. They're straight teeth. They're white teeth. And that's a good thing, beautiful thing. And then notice this is kind of funny. "Whereof every one bear twins and none is barren among them." So each tooth has a pair on the top. That means that she doesn't have any teeth that are missing. That's a good thing as well. So, this is a woman who has all her teeth. They're white, they're clean, they're straight, and he's complimenting her on her beautiful teeth. And sometimes that's not always the case, even in our culture. But that was particularly surprising and beautiful, and he does not miss it. Now, I wanted to just mention here, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 15, in the New Testament reminds us that a woman's long hair is actually something that God even identifies, that nature has really, in a sense, emphasized that as part of her beauty. It says in verse 14, "Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him, but if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering." Now, in that context, it's talking about a prayer covering, but here we're also talking about hair as a covering, which could also provide a sense of modesty, but also beauty and even glory for her. And so I think that's really interesting, that it's one of the ways that God has naturally distinguished between men and women by their hair length and the beauty of their hair. So let me ask you this, men. Do you praise your wife's beauty? You should, but starting with her face. And that's something that will make her feel more appreciated, more loved, not just for her outward appearance, but really particularly for her face. So let's continue on. We've taken a look at her face. Let's take a look and recognize her features. Letter B, verses 3 and 4, is her features. So he doesn't just stop with the physical features of her face. He continues, and verse number 3, he mentions now her lips. He says, "Thy lips are like a thread of scarlet." So this would be a deeper type of red, a rich color red, and the thread, the idea of a line or a cord, and so it is something that then, notice, is parted, because out from these beautiful red lips, speech comes. It would not be very attractive to have a beautiful face and beautiful lips, and then to have rude or harsh words coming out of that mouth. That would really put a damper on that relationship, that interest. But he says that her speech is comely. It's appropriate, and it's also beautiful. And so he mentions not just her physical features that he can see, but he also mentions what she's saying that he can hear with his ears. And so two different senses that we've already identified, sight and hearing. We're going to see other senses as well further down. So he mentions her speech, he mentions her lips, and then he says, thy temples are like a piece of a pomegranate within thy locks. Now, pomegranate has a reddish hue to it, a rouge kind of look, and some have said, well, is this the cheeks or the temples? Some have said it's probably somewhere in between, but it may kind of refer to that blush, or maybe we could call it the rouge of just being youthful and being healthy. And so he notices that, and it's as if it's just kind of peeking between her locks. Again, that could be referring to a veil that has a clasp, or it could be talking about her hair and seeing just a hint of that reddish hue or pink of that color in her cheeks or in the temples. So another feature of her beauty. But then he now compares her neck, and probably this wouldn't be the metaphor we would choose, but nothing wrong with it, especially in that culture, in that context. He says her neck is like the Tower of David, builded for an armory whereon there hang 1,000 bucklers, all shields of mighty men. Now that sounds a little odd to compare her neck to a tower, but think about what a tower is. It's tall, it's elegant, it also is usually thin, like more of maybe a palace, castle, something that is stately. But then he mentions here this idea of bucklers or shields. So I think, and others have suggested the same thing, that likely she's wearing a necklace that has either jewels or maybe even coins on it that would look like shields. So let me read to you a description from one commentary, John Phillips. He says, the shepherd saw around the neck of his beloved a string of coins, such as Eastern women wore, and maybe you've seen something like that before. Those coins, he says, actually symbolized betrothal. So this would indicate that she's promised to him and that she is displaying the fact that she is promised and she is going to stay faithful to him. A string of such coins around the neck, shining in the sun, would look like an array of shields hung on the smooth wall of an armory. And as soon as a suitor obtained a bride's assent, he gave her a betrothal gift. She wore this gift to signify that her affections were already pledged, and as such, it served as a visible deterrent to unwanted advances. So this necklace of coins or of jewels, whatever it was a way to say, I'm already taken. You need to go somewhere else. Find someone else. I am loyal and dedicated to the one who gave me this necklace, and I will intend to stay his. So I think that there's a couple reminders here about how we should identify not just the physical appearance, there is that, but something that is underneath that. And so I would say, men, do you praise your wife for her grace as we think about the graceful tower, and also her modesty as we think about the veil, and we think about the blush, and we think about her purity as we think about her words, and also her loyalty, maybe symbolized by this necklace, by these coins? So I think that we can see not just the beauty, but also the grace, the modesty, the purity. That should be valuable and precious to a husband. Okay, now we move to letter C. This would be her femininity. I'm going to call it her femininity, verses 5 through 7. And look with me at verse 5. And I think that you're going to see that I think this is really what he is complimenting, what he is appreciative of. But it does get to be a little bit more exciting for him. And we kind of mentioned this back in chapter 2, and I referenced chapter 4 from there. And so you can go back there and see the comparison there, some of the same metaphors, the same types of pictures or illustrations. But take a look at verse 5. He says, thy two breasts are like two young roes, dear, that are twins. So they match, which feed among the lilies. We talked about the lilies kind of being a reference to her beauty, to her charm. Until the day break and the shadows flee away, I will get me, he says, to the mountain of myrrh and to hill of frankincense. I think you can understand what those are referring to. Thou art all fair, my love. There is no spot in thee. So he describes her femininity, which is greatly valued and appreciated by him, obviously. But notice he ends by saying that everything about her is beautiful. He doesn't just say, as he said in verse 1, that she is fair. Now he says that she is entirely fair, entirely beautiful. Now stop there for a second. Do you think it's true? In fact, he also says, there is no spot in thee, no blemish at all whatsoever. Do you think that's really true? She probably does have some blemishes, by the way. But he's not focusing on the blemishes. He is focusing on her beauty and her features that are clearly beautiful. And so I think it's important for us, as we think about this, to recognize that there's a wholesomeness and a value and a goodness about valuing and appreciating and praising your spouse for her beauty. And we'll talk about those blemishes in just a moment. But I want you to turn with me to Proverbs chapter 5 and verses 15 through 20. And there's a reminder here that there should be great joy and loyalty and enjoyment of marital intimacy. Proverbs 5, 15 through 20 says, drink waters, this is written by Solomon as well, by the way, out of thine own cistern, and running waters out of thine own well. Let thy fountains be dispersed abroad, and rivers of waters in the streets. Let them be only thine own. Probably talking about your descendants, your progeny. You don't want to have illegitimate children, but just your children with your spouse, and not strangers with thee. Let thy fountain be blessed, and notice, rejoice with the wife of thy youth. That would be your first wife. As long as she's still alive, she should be the one that you share your home with and share your bed with. Let her be as the loving hind and pleasant roe. Let her breasts satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished. This has the idea of to be intoxicated always with her love. And then, why wilt thou, my son, be ravished with a strange woman and embrace the bosom of a stranger? That's illogical. It doesn't make sense. You should be loyal to your wife, to the wife of your youth, and enjoy her and invest in her and develop the closeness with her. And so that's God's plan for marriage. And that's why there's nothing shameful, nothing embarrassing about Song of Solomon chapter 4, because we're talking about two married people, a husband and a wife. In fact, let's go back to that question, that idea about the blemishes. And I think there's a great reference in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 25 through 27. And this is a reminder that the husband-wife relationship is the illustration that God uses for Christ's relationship to the church. It says, their husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church, and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. And so, obviously, in regard to the church, we're talking about spiritual purity, spiritual beauty. In other words, a rejection of sin, which is what brings spot upon our character and upon our relationship with God. So how is it that the church can be blameless or spotless, even though we do still struggle with sin? It's because of the perfect righteousness that Christ has given to us, has placed upon us, so that when God sees us, he doesn't see all of our faults and failures. He sees the righteousness of Christ. And so, we're coming back to Song of Solomon chapter 4. I think that it's a good question for us to ask. First of all, men, will you enjoy your wife's beauty and only your wife's beauty? That's a great reminder. But the second thing I want to ask, thought question, how can unconditional love, such as the love of Christ for the church, and such as a husband should have for his wife, how can that help us to overlook blemishes, faults, failures? Okay, good question I think we'll come back and talk about. Let's move on to number 2. Now, we see that he not only praises her attractiveness, but secondly, he partakes of her appeal. All right, let's take a look at it. Verses 8 and 9, we'll start there. Letter A. First, we'll find his feelings. You know, I kind of find it interesting that a lot of times we kind of oversimplify, or maybe we kind of give the stereotype that women like to talk about their feelings and men just kind of stuff them all down inside and they ignore them and they kind of avoid talking about feelings, and that's probably fairly true. But notice he is talking about his feelings, and that is just very encouraging to her because he's opening up and not just stuffing them or hiding them or thinking that they're silly or stupid. He's talking about his feelings. And I could even say his fascination of her. Take a look at verse 8. Come with me from Lebanon, my spouse. So here's a good reminder to us that yes, they are married. They are spouse and spouse. With me from Lebanon, look from the top of Amana, from the top of Shinir, and Hermon, from the lions' dens, from the mountains of the leopards. And I'm not going to go into every one of those locations. I'll just read one quick passage. Deuteronomy 3, 8, and 9 tells us that when Israel was going into the land of Canaan, it says they took at that time out of the hand of the 2 kings of the Amorites the land that was on this side Jordan from the river Arnon, which comes from the mountain, where was it here? The mountain Amana, and the river Arnon comes from that mountain unto Mount Hermon, and then it says, which Hermon the Sidonians call Sirion, and the Amorites call it Shinir. So Hermon and Shinir, same mountain, just called by 2 different names by 2 different people. I don't think that's really the focus. I think the focus is on the lions and the leopards. And so he says, hey, come away with me from these places where there's danger. And I don't think they were literally in those places. I think he's talking about places where maybe men who are looking at her and want to take advantage of her, as if a lion or a leopard might try to do so. The word ravish actually has that connotation, to take advantage of in some contexts. And so he's saying, hey, let's leave this place where others may be looking at you and trying to take advantage of you to a safe house. That's not, it's the sharp contrast between a lion's den and a safe house. You don't want to be in the lion's den where people are lions are looking you up and down, seeing if they're going to devour you. You don't want to be there. You want to be in a safe house with someone you trust and has your best interests in mind, and they're going to protect you. And yes, they're stronger than you, but you know that they love you and they care about you. And so I think that's the idea here of leaving others who might try to take advantage and harm you and going to the safe place where there is a time for intimacy and for trust and mutual enjoyment. Okay, take a look at verse 9. Thou hast ravished my heart, my sister, my spouse. Now, why does he say my sister? She's not literally his sister, but I think it suggests the familiarity, the companionship, hopefully, between a brother and a sister. I know when you're young, usually that's not there, but as you get older, usually a brother wants to protect his sister. He wants to care for her. He wants to encourage her and not let anybody insult her or harm her. And so I think that's the idea here. He's going to treat her with honor, with respect, with care, with protection, like a young man would or should for his sister. But notice, obviously, she is his spouse, and she has ravished his heart. He is fascinated by her. He is excited to be with her. And so he tells her, he says, thou hast ravished my heart with one of thine eyes. It didn't even take 2 eyes. It only took 1 eye. Maybe one of her eyes is kind of obscured behind the veil or behind some hair, and it's just 1 eye. It didn't even take 2 eyes to just excite him and intoxicate him with her. And so that's why he shares with her that is something that has encouraged him and has drawn him to her. And then he says, with one chain of thy neck, one part of her necklace. It's just so beautiful to see it on her that it just excites him, and he doesn't mind telling her. So he shares his feelings. And you know, guys, I know it's uncomfortable. It's not natural. We don't typically do that. But it's okay to let your wife know how you feel. And don't just unload and tell her all the terrible things that happened during your day. Maybe she wants to hear a synopsis of some of those things. But more importantly, let her know that you love her, that you care about her, and you want to hear how her day was. And then let her know what you think about those things and how to encourage her. So let me ask, will you protect your spouse from others? How? With your attention. And he is giving her attention so that she doesn't have to look for attention or relational closeness somewhere else. He is giving it to her, so there is going to be a bond. There's going to be a developing unity. Okay, let's move on to letter B. And I had to choose two words because in these verses, there's clearly two ideas. And you'll see what I mean when we get into them. So letter B, two words, verses 10 and 11, her fragrances and also her flavors. Okay, fragrances and flavors. I mentioned to you that we already talked about two of the senses, the sight and the hearing, the sound. But now we're going to get into the smell and also the taste. So let's take a look at verse 10. How fair is thy love, my sister, my spouse. So now he's not just commenting on the fact that she is his love, but he's commenting on the fact that she loves him. Her expressions of love are something that he greatly values and finds beautiful. And he tells her so. How fair is thy love, my sister, my spouse. How much better is thy love than wine. Isn't that interesting? We talked about being ravished has the idea of almost to be intoxicated. And so he finds her and her expressions of love to be far more exciting and interesting than going out to drink. And obviously wine can intoxicate. It can cause you to feel certain ways and relax and other things. But we've been told in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 18, to not be drunk with wine wherein is excess, but to be filled with the Spirit. And also here we're told that the genuine closeness and affection between a man and his wife should be more satisfying than wine. And then he says, and the smell of thine ointments than all spices. Not all spice the spice, but all of the kinds of spices that you could imagine. And so he's talking about maybe some perfume that she put on, or maybe it's some incense that's burning nearby, or something that she's used to clean the house, and there's an ointment or a lotion that she's put on. And he's commenting that this is a wonderful smell, and it's something he definitely enjoys. It's better than all of the spices that could be gathered, because it's her who smells of this aroma. Then notice then, verse number 11, he comments on her lips. He says, thy lips, O my spouse, drop, or we could say drip, as the honeycomb. So if you look at a honeycomb and you see that it's got a drip just about to fall from it, it glistens and it looks full and rich and enticing. And he says that her lips for him are exciting and enticing, and they're rich. And then he says, honey and milk are under thy tongue, and the smell of thy garments is like the smell of Lebanon. So we don't know what she's wearing, but whatever she's wearing, it smells perhaps of the cedars of Lebanon, or perhaps some other kinds of scents that you would smell out in the fresh air in the forest, something just beautiful and not musty or dark or dingy, clean and fresh. But then also he mentions, again, her mouth being sweet. And I don't know exactly how far you would take that, but I think it's clear that he is excited to kiss her. And I think that he's describing the fact that maybe as he kisses her, she has good breath. It's not something that's off-turning, but it's something that is inviting, and it's something enjoyable, something good. So I mentioned here all 5 senses, all right? And we're going to get into the touch, of course, as well. but we've talked about the scent, smell. We've talked about the taste. We've talked about the hearing. And we've also talked, of course, about sight. So let me contrast that, because we've talked about the wife, the spouse, having this idea of, sweetness and honey and maybe even sweet words coming from her lips. But then turn to Proverbs chapter 5. And verses 3 through 5, we see the same images used to describe the strange woman, the harlot. However, it starts sweet, but it ends bitter. Proverbs chapter 5, verses 3 through 5 says, "For the lips of a strange woman drop as an honeycomb," or drip as a honeycomb. Very similar. Do you see it? "And her mouth is smoother than oil, but her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps take hold on hell." It may start out sweet, but it ends in extreme bitterness and destruction and death. But that's not the case for your spouse, for the woman who is the wife of your youth. There's no bitterness that comes from that. It's sweetness and joy and excitement. And we could even say good intoxication, the right kind of intoxication. So that's a contrast. Let me ask, will you be satisfied with the love of your spouse? You should be. Okay, let's move on to letter C. We're going to find here, I got to hurry, her fruit and her flowers, because she's described as a garden. Okay, so letter C, her fruit and flowers. Verse 12 says, "A garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse, a spring shut up, a fountain sealed." So the joys and the excitements and the features of her beauty and her charms, they're not for everyone else. That means she's modest. She's not showing off. She's not immodest. She's keeping those features, those charms, hidden, and she's saving them for her husband. And so let me caution our ladies, we ought not to be, going to the beach and wearing things that you wouldn't want other people to see you wear, that are typically should be only for the bedroom. And so once again, she's an enclosed garden. She is modest, and she's keeping it only for her spouse. And then it says, "Thy plants are an orchard of pomegranates." He describes the fruit that he can go and enjoy in her garden with pleasant fruits, camphire and spikenard, so those would be scents that he would smell that often come from flowers, spikenard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon, with all trees of frankincense, myrrh, and aloes, with all the chief spices. What an incredible garden this is. And he just describes everything's there. Everything's rich and beautiful and wonderful and exciting. A fountain of gardens, a well of living waters, and streams from Lebanon. What an incredible garden with fountains. Now, think about this. This is a fountain of living waters. It's something that's like a spring. It just continues to bubble forth fresh, good, clean water. It doesn't close off and stop and say, "Oh, you've had enough. No more of that." And so it symbolizes this openness, this willingness to continue to give from this garden to your spouse. And so it's a continual enjoyment. So, will you keep the blessings of your love for your spouse alone? That's who it's designed for. Okay, let's finish up letter D, verses 16 down through verses 1 of chapter 5. And this would be letter D, his feast. His feast. He's described all of these wonderful things inside this garden, and she's been saving this garden just for him. So notice with me now, she calls the north wind. She says, "Awake, O north wind, and come, thou south wind, blow upon my garden, that the spices thereof may flow out. Let my beloved, him, come into his garden. she doesn't say it's her garden. She says it's his garden. It's for him to enjoy, and only him. And notice, eat his pleasant fruits. Let him enjoy it as much as he wants to, because it's all for him. What an incredible attitude of selflessness and giving. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we've already read it recently, verses 3 and 4, really teach the same thing. That your body is for your spouse, and his body is for you. And that's meant to be a wonderful, unselfish giving and sharing. Then notice in chapter 5, verse 1, he responds, and he comes. I am come into my garden, because she said it's for him. It's his garden, my sister, my spouse. I have gathered my myrrh with my spice. I have eaten my honeycomb with my honey. I have drunk my wine with my milk. He has come to enjoy all of her beauty, all of her features, all of her charms. And notice, this is the verse in all of Scripture that has the word my more times. Did you notice that? Because she has given it to him. And so therefore he has claimed it. And he has accepted her gift, and he has valued it, and he has praised her for it, and he has appreciated it. So, this is what we call the marriage bed. Hebrews 13:4 reminds us, marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled. It's sacred. But whoremongers and adulterers, God will judge. Very clear and sharp contrast. So let me ask you this, and let me remind you of this. We can enjoy intimacy. We should enjoy intimacy as a good gift from God. No shame in that. In fact, Genesis 2:24 and 25, therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. No shame in that wonderful unity of a husband and wife. So a question for us, how can you satisfy and be satisfied with your spouse? So a Christian can fall into two opposite errors in regard to sexual intimacy. The first error is to accept the worldview that intimacy is nothing more than a biological function that means nothing and can be enjoyed like any other recreation. But even as the world suggests that intimacy means nothing, it acts as if it means everything. Our world has made it into an idol, a false god that it worships. But the second error, in reaction to this view, implies that intimacy means nothing by placing it into a lockbox of taboo topics and failing to communicate the Bible's teaching. The Bible teaches that intimacy means unity in the most deep and rich sense. A man shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall become one flesh. God intends for a man and wife to enjoy each other with all five senses. And I think we saw that very clearly tonight. Father, help us as we think about this beautiful depiction of intimacy between a husband and wife. Help us, Lord, to strive to develop and to maintain the same level of beautiful intimacy for the entirety of our married life. It's in Jesus Christ's name I pray. Amen. Okay, I went long. Sorry about that. Let's go ahead and take a look at our prayer list, and then we'll come back for some discussion. So a couple of quick updates. Also, continue to pray for the